Good evening. Okay. Whoops. Tonight, we will learn about a most fascinating period of history. The time when Columbus was sailing the ocean blue in 1492, and then when the European world was chasing after spices, developing oceanic sailing ships, creating maps, and competing to find new sea routes. David Landauer will take us on this voyage. Please welcome David Landauer.
Thank you, Diane. You know, it's always kind of funny to me that we talk about that little rhyme, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And have you ever thought about it, that if you did it a year later, then you could always say, in 1493, Columbus sailed the deep blue sea. I haven't quite taken it any further than that, so we'll leave it at that. So anyway, tonight we're talking about sailors, spices, and spies. It all started with the spices, these wonderful, pungent, aromatic substances that came from parts unknown. Spice was known to the Romans, so there was quite an enterprising spice trade, you know, even in the ancient world. And of course, the Romans, you know, were a little curious. Where does this wonderful stuff come from? Well, we'll see, in fact, maps of the islands they come from. But the people who sold these things to the Romans, they were no fools. They weren't going to tell the Romans something like, well, you go down the Red Sea, take a left at Yemen, and you keep on going, and you're bound to find it, because that would put them out of business. So instead, they would tell them the most outlandish tales. Oh, master, you don't want to go there. You see the four of us? We're all that's left from a crew of 200, because this island is guarded by a gigantic three-headed dog who can take off a limb with one bite. Or sometimes it was a giant bird the size of an elephant that would pick up whole ships. And so consequently, you didn't mess with this. Now, I don't know if all of these outlandish stories scared off the would-be Roman spice traders, but interestingly enough, some of them did end up as monsters in the stories we call the Arabian Nights. So anyway, the Romans knew about this, but in the early Middle Ages, the use of spices and the spice trade kind of dried up. And then it was in the late Middle Ages, after the Crusades, that Europe once again discovered spice. Well, by this time, the spice trade had come through Constantinople. And let's see, it's right about there, that little purple thing there. So while the Byzantine Empire was flourishing, the spice trade was fine. Sometimes it came overland, sometimes it came by sea, but it all came through Constantinople, and then various trading cities such as Pisa, Genoa, Venice would then take over from there and sell these things, probably at greatly accelerated prices, to Europeans for use in their food. Well, when the Ottoman Empire, and you can see the Ottoman Empire all over the place here, started encroaching on the Byzantines, the spice trade and more of the locations dealing with it came under the Ottomans. Well, there was nothing wrong with that, okay? The Ottomans were perfectly willing, you know, to act as intermediaries in the spice trade. There was just one problem, that they put such high taxes on the spice that the Europeans found that it's a little bit hard to afford this stuff. So, gee, we got to find a better way of doing it. Now, a couple of things to look at on the map here. This and this were about all that was left of the Byzantine Empire by the time that the Turks came through. You can see the Ottoman Empire there. But you notice these little places, little green places and blue places. These were the trading enclaves of various trading cities, Italian cities like Pisa, Genoa, and Venice. And as we're going to see in a few minutes, a very notable son of Genoa, some guy by the name of Columbus, actually took his first voyage to the little island of Keese, which you see right about there. By the way, that was as close as he ever came to Asia, in spite of all of his protesting that, hey, you know, I made it to Asia, you've got to respect that. So, okay, we want to do the spice trade. How are we going to find out where the spice is? I know, we'll get a map. So there's a map. Doesn't tell you an awful lot. This is pretty much a typical medieval map. You'll find in all the maps I'm going to show you, the center of the map is the Mediterranean Sea. That's not by accident. That's because all the trading went around the Mediterranean. So if you study the history of ancient times, if you study early modern Europe, everything's around the Mediterranean Sea. That's where all the trading took place. So you see it there. North is on the left side of the map here, and there's absolutely no scale for distance. So I don't know how you would use this. I mean, you know, you couldn't take this out of the, glove compartment of your car and say, well, let's see, where am I on this thing? You'd never be able to figure it out. Europe had even maps that were even worse. This was a map from the 7th century AD, and it's simply called the T and O map because all of the water is shown as the letters T and O. So what you've got there is you've got the Mediterranean Sea, that's this here, and you got seas here, this one presumably being the Red Sea, the Black Sea up here, and then of course you have the 3 continents. We all know there are only 3 continents, right? So you have Europa, Africa, Asia, and the names associated with those are the sons of Noah, because liturgy told people that each continent is the descendants of one of Noah's sons. So you have Japhet, you have Cham, and you have Sem, and they were considered to be the progenitors or the forefathers of all the inhabitants in a given continent. So we talked about the T part, now about the O part. The O was the ocean sea. That is, that all the continents were surrounded by a body of water you can see called the ocean sea. You see it written up there, Mare Oceani. So that was it. If we thought that first map we saw was bad, I have no idea what you'd make of this one. You can barely tell anything about it other than the fact that, yep, we got 3 continents. What makes this really sad is the fact that hundreds of years before, the Greeks had maps that were fairly decent. So you can see this one by Dionysius Periogatus, and this is like 1,000 years before the map you just saw, the T&O map of the Bishop of Seville. It's not bad. Once again, there's the Mediterranean right in the center. He knew a little bit about southern Europe. He knew there were some islands up here, didn't have much to do with the shape of them. And one thing you're going to see in common on these maps, they have no idea what's down here. They know there's Africa, but aside from North Africa, that many of them knew about and had traveled through and had traded with, they really didn't have a good idea of what was further south in Africa. We find as we go through these maps that the best maps of the time were drawn by either Muslim or Jewish cartographers. These were the people who didn't make their map according to what was in Scripture. They did it according to what sailors told them. So they actually talked to people who had traveled. They found out where things were. So here's a map, as you can see, from 1154. It's not bad. I mean, for example, you can see down here, they've got that bump in India there. There's Arabia, once again Africa, but we have no idea how far it goes down. They exaggerated the Adriatic Sea, but at least they got it there. Once again, they know there's some islands up here, and they know there's this peninsula where Spain and Portugal are, the Iberian Peninsula. So this is not really too bad a way of looking at it. But we can get better. Thanks to the Portuguese and thanks to Catalonia, various noblemen decided we need better maps. And they found that the people who would draw them were on the island of Majorca in the Balearic Islands, which you can see right about there. In some cases, they were Islamic. In some cases, they were Jewish. But they went ahead and actually detailed how they would look at this map. So they used trigonometry, they used geometry, and so if you look at this map, particularly, for example, what really impressed me, this is around 1375. Look at the Black Sea up there. That's almost perfect. Considering they couldn't check with, their navigational satellites to see what this looked like, that's a really good map of the Black Sea, and this all comes from a gentleman by the name of Abraham Crescius, who was a Jewish cartographer, in the Balearic Islands. So Crescus and his son, Yehuda was his name, received an assignment from Prince John of Aragon to make a series of nautical charts which would go beyond the normal geographic representations, so you could actually use these things to trade with, to get on a ship and say, hey, here's where we're going. Now, here's how these things worked. You see all those little lines on the map. Now, you probably know enough to realize these are not lines of longitude or latitude. They're called plumb lines. And the way these worked is that if you were a sailor, you took an approximate heading from where you were, and you knew where you were, to where you wanted to go. Once again, generally within the Mediterranean area. By this time they had the compass, so you were able to make pretty much an accurate heading of where you were going. You simply sailed out according to what was on your plumb line. There was no real problem with this, because when you landed on the opposite shore, you went and talked to people and said, okay, where am I? Oh, you're in Pisa. Pisa, I wanted to get to Genoa. Well, that's up the coast. Not a problem. Another day, day and a half, you're there. You can do that in the Mediterranean. It's a little harder in the Atlantic Ocean, because if you get stuck going in the wrong direction of the Atlantic, you could be going for a very, very long time. So anyway, you can see, however, how this map is like a giant leap forward, because it actually is something that mariners and traders can actually use. Now, the people who took advantage of this were not only the Spanish from Aragon and from Catalonia, but also the Portuguese. Now, the Portuguese, are right there on the Atlantic Ocean. So they're looking at this and saying, it's all very well and good how nicely Abraham and his son Yehuda got the Mediterranean, but that doesn't help us a lot, because we're out here, okay? And if we're going to start exploring for spices, remember that's the ultimate goal, we're going to have to go out into what has been called the Ocean Sea. We know it as the Atlantic Ocean. And we're going to have to figure out how to get down there, how to get back, and what's going on with this. So consequently, we find a gentleman by the name of Prince Henry the Navigator. He was the brother of King John of Portugal. So on the left, we have Prince Henry, and on the right, we have Prince Henry, because to this day, nobody knows what he looked like. You see his dates there. And not only did we not know what he looked like, even though he's considered the father of Portuguese oceanic navigation, we aren't entirely sure what he did. He's given credit for starting a school of navigation at the very southwestern point of Portugal, and you'll see it in the map in just a minute. But in fact, there really wasn't a school per se. So one writer about the subject comments as follows: there was no center of navigation science or observatory in the modern sense of the word, nor was there even an organized navigational center. This didn't stop various mathematicians and cartographers from nevertheless claiming that the navigation school at Sagra prepared Portuguese sailors so well and provided them with instruments that they became the foremost map makers and navigators, in Europe. So this is Portugal, and you see way down here on the tip, that's where the so-called school was. Well, it wasn't a school, it didn't have classes. What this became, however, was kind of an information exchange mart, if you think about it. Navigators from all over Europe were invited to come there to share their stories, to take back informations, about how things worked. And because of where it is, they were able to study, to a certain degree, various rules of the tides. They were able to study some of the currents in the Atlantic Ocean. Probably most importantly, they studied the winds. At Sagra, or Point St. Vincent there is even right now this gigantic circle cut in the ground with lines on it. And nobody could figure out what that's for until about 30, 40 years ago. People realized this is like a windrose. That is, the people who came here to study and exchange information were using this to track the various winds. So with this kind of information in hand, the Portuguese started exploring down the coast of Africa. Henry personally sponsored these voyages, and on behalf of Portugal, he collected a 20% tax on all profits made by these expeditions. Because 20% is 1/5, it was called o quinto. That was the usual practice at the time. The voyages were in very small ships, mostly the caravel, and again, these were mostly ships that were used to sailing on the Mediterranean. So it didn't take them long to realize we're going to have to change our style of ships if we're going to be out there in the big Atlantic Ocean. During Henry's time, the Portuguese navigators discovered and perfected what was called the volta do mar, or turn at sea. And what forced them to do this, you notice how they're working their way down the coast of Africa. So here we are, Cape Bojador, Cape Blanco, Cape Verde. When they got to Cape Verde, they discovered something that at first frightened them immensely. That was the current would carry you southward along the African coast, but when you tried to return northward, the current was so strong you couldn't fight it. It prevented you from going north, and they're thinking to themselves, how are we going to get home? Well, they discovered the Volta do Mar based on the currents, because you see there's a clockwise current there. So what they realized was we're not going to fight the current by trying to force our way north. What we're going to do is we're going to go with the current, which takes you out to the north and west. That is, they had to sail away from Africa in the direction they didn't particularly want to go. But this would allow them to take advantage of the circular current. So they'd come to kind of the top of that and then take a left turn, and suddenly they're way up here and they can get home. So that was one of the things that the Portuguese navigators and sailors developed, the Volta do Mar. All of these things that the Portuguese developed, by the way, after the time of Henry, they started keeping to themselves. There was starting to be a movement that said, you know what? We've worked really hard to learn this. Why does everybody else have to horn in on what we're learning? So we're going to kind of keep some of this information to ourselves. And that's where the spies came in, because all of a sudden, maps, information about winds, information about currents, all of this navigation stuff became what we would call today top secret. You didn't exactly blab it, and people had to find out about it either by stealing it or by that good old-fashioned technique called bribery. So this is where Portugal started making its name as great navigators. Well, you can see that by 1482, they not only hit area around Nigeria, but even the mouth of the Congo River. So what they were gradually doing is they were finding their way further and further south. Now, if you remember some of the maps we saw, they had no idea what was, south of Africa. For all they knew, that you couldn't get around Africa, that Africa somehow bottomed out at the bottom of the world, maybe at Antarctica. So all of this attempt to get around Africa to get to those Spice Islands, maybe that wasn't going to work so well. They persevered. Their first surprise was after they rounded that huge bump in West Africa, and suddenly they thought, okay, now we're around Africa. Nope, not quite, because when you go further in, there's still more Africa to be navigated around. So it wasn't until 1488 that a Portuguese sailor by the name of Bartolomeu Dias reached the Cape of Good Hope, and for the first time, Europeans realized, hey, what do you know? We actually can sail around Africa. Isn't that great? Well, it was a few years later when another seaman by the name of Vasco da Gama, as you can see the dates there, 1497 to 1499, he actually took that trip. He came to the Cape of Good Hope, he set his sails to the northeast, and he started sailing, and he ended up in India. Started trading posts in India, and all of a sudden Europe realized, hey, wait a minute, there's more to this than we thought. We can find all kinds of ways to get around that land blockade of our old enemies, the Ottomans, and instead trade directly with India. So the Portuguese now are becoming very, very rich. They discovered gold on a place that, lately has been called the Gold Coast in Africa, that is up here. their first coins made of gold were made around 1444. So Portugal now seems to be the place you want to be if you're a navigator. And they had done a wonderful job exploring, preparing data, and above all, taking information back to the Portuguese capital, Lisbon, to put it on maps. Well, they weren't the only one preparing maps. This gentleman named Martin Behaim, you can see his dates there from 1459 to 1507. He was quite a character. He was born in Nuremberg in Germany. He was an adventurer, an astronomer, a cartographer in his own right, and a bit of an explorer. He also tried to be a businessman, but most of his business ventures failed. He had the habit of picking up information, and if the information didn't belong to him, well, it didn't really matter much. He copied it anyway and went on with his business. He started out in the cloth business, soon found himself apprenticed to a clothier in Flanders, that is modern Belgium. He started studying mathematics, started looking at maps, and he realized that there was a wealth of information here, and that the center of the information was not where he was in Flanders, but down in Portugal. So he went to Portugal. And soon he developed such a reputation as a mathematician and map maker that he was invited by King John II of Portugal to sit on a council of navigation. So Behaim now is becoming like the brain trust, a one-man brain trust, where he understands what they're doing, but there's one step missing. He hasn't actually been on a voyage. So between 1485 and 1486, he took part in a Portuguese expedition bound for Africa, and he was able to experience firsthand some of the wonders of Portuguese discovery, how they navigated, how they used the winds, how they used the currents. Well, about 1490, he returned to his home city of Nuremberg, and his purpose, he said, was to provide knowledge of expeditions of navigation to the cloth merchants of that city. But what he really was trying to do was he was trying to figure out that with all the stuff we're learning, what does the world really look like? I mean, so far, all we've had are some of the maps that you've seen. So he came up with the idea that, well, you know, we know the Earth is round, so why don't we portray it as a round object? And he called it an Erdapfel. That's German for earth apple. He didn't know it was a globe. That hadn't been put in the Oxford English Dictionary yet. So he called it the earth apple. It's really a remarkable piece of work because he not only bases this on what he has witnessed personally, but he's also gone back and studied the old Greeks and Romans, including Ptolemy and Strabo, and he was able to depict all the continents that were known at that time, and even worked in some of the mythological islands in the Atlantic. So looking at his globe, here's the detail of the Atlantic Ocean. And for the first time, people are getting the idea, wait a minute, we thought that big greenish, bluish thing was empty. Nah, it's not empty at all. Look at all the neat little places you can find. You got this here and this up here and all kinds of stuff. And oh, by the way, I think that because the world is round, Behaim said, you can sail to Japan, Sipangu, that's Japan. So all of a sudden, we're starting to realize you don't have to sail east to get to the eastern locations. You can sail west and still get to the eastern locations. And of course, the people who said the world is flat said this is ridiculous, so forget about it. But nevertheless, it's a great piece of work. Behaim, we don't know all of his sources. As I said, he went back to the ancient Greeks, he went to the Romans, he talked to the Portuguese, we don't know who else he talked to. But he may have known more than he actually depicted on his globe. And there's a very tantalizing passage in the journal of a sailor by the name of Antonio Pigafetta, who was on Magellan's voyage between 1519 and 1522. That was the first voyage that sailed completely around the world. One of the things that Magellan did was he sailed through a little body of water at the very tip of South America, which we now call the Strait of Magellan. And here's what Pigafetta had to say about that. But Hernando, that's Magellan, knew that it was a question of a very mysterious strait by which one could sail and which he had seen described on a map in the treasury of the King of Portugal, the map having been made by an excellent man called Martin de Bohemia, that is, Martin Behaim. So we don't know, had Martin seen something that gave him a clue, or did he merely realize that if there was a body of water there, that perhaps, when you went further enough south, you were able to get around the land. I mean, after all, they had proven you could do it with Africa, so maybe if there was something else out there, you could get around that as well. And this, of course, got a lot of people thinking, including these two gentlemen, Christopher Columbus, the older son of a wool merchant and minor city functionary in Genoa, and his younger brother, Bartholomew. And they're quite a bunch, these two. Very enterprising, very interested in navigation, in travel. Both of them, Christopher and Bartholomew, were always trying to pick up information anywhere they can. And like Martin Behaim, if it wasn't their information, well, they would take it anyway and go off with it. So we, of course, tend to look more at Columbus, Christopher that is, but we need to also keep in the back of our minds what Bartholomew was doing, because it was Bartholomew who was sort of the business manager of the Columbus brothers' enterprise. Oh, he was one other thing. He was the keeper of maps for the King of Portugal in Lisbon during the time that his brother's voyages started. So if you ever wonder where Christopher got his information from, he got it from the best source available, namely the Royal Arsenal in Lisbon, where his brother kept the maps. Why Columbus? With all these people we've been talking about, Prince Henry the Navigator, Bartholomew Diaz, Vasco da Gama. So why is it Columbus that we remember today as this great explorer? And I've kind of styled this as a sort of mathematical equation, because we're going to look at Columbus as the sum of his parts. Well, the very first part was he was from Genoa. And this mattered. And the reason it mattered is because the Genoese were all over different ports in the North Atlantic, and also had a few holdings, in the Mediterranean. Now, we had talked before about how different trading cities, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, had been the main trading partners with the Byzantines and to some degree with the Arabs in the Mediterranean. But it was Venice that had the stronger navy, and Venice essentially managed to push all its rival cities out of the Eastern Mediterranean. So, okay, if you go to the Eastern Mediterranean, except for one location, namely the island of Keose, which you see referred to right here, you're dealing with the Venetians. By the way, Marco Polo was from Venice, and so now you understand how he got around so much, because his city was probably the leading trading city of those northern Italian cities there. So what does Genoa do? Genoa has now been pretty much shut out of the Eastern Mediterranean, so they do the next best thing. They move to the Western Mediterranean. Suddenly, Genoa is setting up trading posts in places like Barcelona. They go out into the sea, into the Atlantic Ocean, to Lagos. They even go as far as Bristol in England. So essentially, if you're a seafaring person and you're going out into the Western Mediterranean, you're going out in the Atlantic Ocean, it helps if you're Genoese, because you're always going to find somebody who'll, say, hey, it's one of our people from home, come on in. Let me share information with you. What can we do for you today? And that's pretty much what Columbus was able to do. So if you look at how far he was able to sail, he sailed east, north, and south, and in each case, he was able to leverage his being Genoese, to a certain degree. Now, only to a certain degree, and here's how that plays in. So here are his first voyages. Apparently, the first time he was a voyager, he was about 22 years old, and he went to the Genoese trading post at Chios. Remember, we talked about that. That was one of the few places that the Venetians had not pushed the Genoese out of. By the way, that's right next to the country we now call Turkey, and that was as close to Asia as Christopher Columbus ever got. In spite of all of his protests that he had discovered a new way to Asia, he had never gotten any closer than he did on his very first voyage. Now, on his second voyage, things didn't fare so well. He was part of a Genoese contingent that we believe included warships that got about as far as Lagos off the coast of Portugal when it was attacked by French either pirate vessels or military vessels. Columbus was shipwrecked. He managed to cling to some pieces of wood, float ashore to Lagos, and so it would have been an irony in history that one of his greatest sailors would have been drowned on almost his first voyage. But he wasn't. He came ashore, and he found there was a Genoese settlement in Lagos. So, of course, he comes up and says, "Hi, I'm from the same city you folks." Next thing you know, he's not only being welcomed into the Genoese community, but because the Genoese are seafarers like the Portuguese, he's welcomed to the Portuguese community. So all of a sudden, Columbus is doing an awful lot of sailing and exploring under the flag of Portugal. And here's some of the places he went. He went as far north as Iceland, although his son, by the name of Ferdinand, when he wrote his life about his father, Ferdinand kept hinting that his father, Christopher, went even further north than Iceland. Well, we're not sure what that meant. Did he go to Greenland? There's no proof of it. But at any rate, yes, he was in Iceland. We know that he was in Britain, in England in 1479. And in 1478, he had been part of a trading fleet that the Portuguese had sent to the island of Madeira, which they had colonized about 2 generations before. He had gone even further. Columbus had sailed all the way down in Africa, as you can see there. So you start to look at this guy, Columbus, and you say, you know, he wasn't just some guy who sailed across the Atlantic. He had been all over the Atlantic before he even came up with the idea of sailing across it. So, for example, he learned a lot of the techniques. He had maritime experience, and of course, being stranded in Portugal back in 1476 helped because now he was picking up all those tricks that the Portuguese had learned. So he learned the volta do mar, he learned about the currents, he learned about the winds. And as we'll see in just a minute, his knowledge of the winds influenced the direction he took, not only to sail to America, but to sail back. So, you know, this is a young man who's learning a great deal, and he's remembering what he learns. So he's one of the most knowledgeable sailors around. He first learned from his own people, the Genoese, but he's learning a great deal from the Portuguese. By the way, on Madeira, he married into what they call a genteel but impoverished noble family. He had inherited some of his dead father-in-law's papers and discovered that his father-in-law was as much a student of oceanography as he, Columbus, was. So there's another aspect to Columbus that because now he's kind of enmeshed himself in Portuguese society, that he's picking up all kinds of information. And as you can see from the bottom, it didn't hurt that his brother was in the chart-making business in Lisbon at the time and was about to be appointed the caretaker of Portugal's most important maps. So we said that Columbus learned the wind patterns. So here you see, these are the wind patterns in that part of the Atlantic. And oh, by the way, the little red lines there, that's his voyage out in 1492 toward America. This is his voyage back. Look at how closely they follow the wind patterns. Anybody want to think that that's accidental? Because it wasn't. Because Columbus understood the wind patterns in that part of the Atlantic. And if you need proof, there it is right on the map for how this works. This shows, you know, how this works entirely when you look at his entire first voyage, which we'll see again. So we've got him as Genoese. He's got a great deal of maritime experience. He's been to Portugal. He's been to Madeira. And you can see why that's important. Because now that he's in that society and is getting the papers from his dead father-in-law, he's starting to decide there's something more here than just islands. But what is it? Columbus's brother-in-law would tell him that after a particularly violent storm there would be all kinds of debris, including tree trunks, washed up on the northwest shore of one of the islands in the Madeiras. Well, where did this come from? Did it come from the Azores, or did it come from somewhere further west? And if it came from somewhere further west, then what is that? Is that Asia? So he had access to maps, all kinds of maps. As we said, maps were a rare and valuable commodity that were guarded like top secret. Columbus was able to get hold of maps because Bartholomew was the archivist. And according to the author, Lisa Jardine, when Columbus was running out of money, Bartholomew let him come into the archive, and on a number of pieces of paper, he copied out details of the one large map that the Portuguese kept, showing all their discoveries and all the knowledge that they had accrued. What Columbus did with these maps, Professor Jardine says there were 11 of them. We aren't sure, but he probably sold them, to other voyagers, probably sold them into Central Europe, which really was a waste of time because by that time Martin Behaim had taken the same information and had made his Erdapfel. About this time, once again with Columbus being part of Portuguese society, Columbus was made aware of a very learned Florentine scholar, that is from the city of Florence, by the name of Paolo del Pazzo Toscanelli. And Toscanelli was quite a character in his own right. He had attended the Great Council of Florence in 1439 that was sponsored by Cosimo de' Medici. And what was happening in Florence in 1439 was the Byzantines, who were about to lose their empire completely, had come west to try to get some kind of aid and maybe develop an understanding with Western Christianity, particularly with the Italians. And Cosimo had engineered it that this conference would take place in his home city, Florence. Well, the Byzantines didn't just come with soldiers and diplomats, they brought scholars. For example, they brought scholars, one by the name of Platon, Georgius Platon, who introduced Western Europe to some old Greek thinker by the name of Plato. Because before this time, before 1439, all that the Western Europeans knew was, Aristotle, we know about him. Well, suddenly now they realize there's one guy older than Aristotle, and that's Plato. Well, they also brought geographers. So here's Toscanelli, who was a doctor by profession. So he had studied science. And he's talking to all of these Greeks, to all of these Byzantines, and he's finding out all kinds of stuff, that he had never realized. So what he decided to do was turn his findings into a map, as you can see there in 1474. He corresponded with a churchman in Lisbon, and the Columbus brothers found out about it. And they were immediately struck by the fact that not only does Toscanelli's map show how close Asia is to Western Europe, but they were even able to correspond with him. So the first letter, the one that had gone to the Portuguese churchman, was also copied for Columbus and his brother, and here's what it said. Also in the time of Eugenius of Cathay, navigators and map makers came and affirmed their great kindness toward Christians, and I personally had a long conversation with this Eugenius on many subjects. I discovered there were nearly 200 cities with marble bridges, great in length and breadth, everywhere with columns in what we call Cathay. This country is worth seeking by the Latins, not only because of the great wealth that may be obtained from it, gold and silver, all kinds of spices, gems, which never reach us, but also because we can learn from them the skill and art so powerful, of such a great province. So that was in the first letter. And then when the Columbus brothers wrote Toscanelli personally, Toscanelli wrote back, "The said voyage, that is traveling west to get to Cathay, or China, is not only possible, but it is true and certain to be honorable and to yield incalculable profit and very great fame among all Christians. But you cannot know this perfectly save through experience and practice, as I have had in the form of the most copious and good and true information from distinguished men of great learning who have come from those parts, here in the court of Rome and in Florence, and from others being merchants who have had business for a long time in that region. So now you can see these ideas coming to the Columbus brothers saying, wow, this is really great. We suspected there was something out there to the west. Look, Toscanelli has actually mapped it out. All we have to do is sail due west, and we're going to discover Asia. Oops, one too many. Well, Columbus, you can see, had a lot of positive things going for him, but I have to talk about a negative. He realized that the world was a very large place. It was made up into 360 degrees of longitude. And he says, well, wait a minute, just how far is all this from me? So when he started looking at the numbers, well, I guess the simplest way to put it is he started fudging the numbers to make them come out the way he wanted. Let me read you a little extract about this. In ancient times, the thinker Ptolemy had written that 1/2 the surface of the world was water, that is 180 degrees, and another 180 degrees was land. Columbus didn't like that, so he went back to an earlier Greek, Marinus of Tyre, who postulated a 225-degree Eurasian span, thus leaving only 135 degrees of ocean. Well, that wasn't enough for Columbus, so he added another 28 degrees to arrive at Marco Polo's erroneous estimation of the breadth of Asia. You see, when Marco Polo wrote his memoirs, because of course he had actually traveled in China, he thought that China was about 6,000 miles wider than it actually was. So Columbus seized on this and said, you see how big it is? You know, there can't be much ocean there at all. He went even further. Marco Polo estimated that Japan was 1,500 miles off the coast of China, when in fact it's barely 200. So Columbus threw that in there as well and said, wow, now I've got 283 degrees of longitude. I only have 77 degrees of open ocean between Portugal and Japan. Well, he even lopped 9 degrees off of that because he says, well, we're actually starting not from Portugal, we're going to start from the Canary Islands, so that gives us another 9 degrees. So consequently, he was able to whittle this down to the point that he said there's barely 60 degrees, of longitude between where I'm sailing from, in this case the Canary Islands, and Japan. Well, how much is that in miles? Well, in Roman miles, it was calculated that a degree at the equator is roughly 60 nautical miles. Well, that was too much for Columbus. So he went and he used figures from Arab mathematicians that said that a mile was only about 40, or a degree was only about 40 miles at the equator. So you can see, just by the way he worked the numbers, he was able to cut, nearly a third off of what he had even extrapolated on his own. So consequently, you go back to the map, he looks at the map and says, hey, works perfectly. I mean, look at that. That's only about 2,500 miles. I mean, that's like a chip shot, So Columbus then started going around and talking to people about this, and above all, he went to various royal courts. Well, in 1485, he went to the royal court in Portugal, not surprisingly, because Portugal, of course, was the major sea power, going out in the Atlantic at that time. Well, they weren't impressed. First of all, the Portuguese were doing just fine sailing south and eventually east, so they didn't need some nutcase going west. And furthermore, when Columbus tried to present his numbers, the various savants, scientists, and map makers at the Portuguese court said, what the heck is this guy smoking? Doesn't he realize how big the world is? There's not 2,400 miles between roughly Portugal and Japan. There's close to 11,000 miles. Of course, they didn't know there'd be a continent in the way there. So Columbus then had to take his show on the road, and according to Professor Jardine, paid for it with stolen maps, with maps that his brother Bartholomew put at his disposal for him to copy and take with him. So by the beginning of 1489, Columbus, waiting for a decision from the various courts in Europe, was running short of money, and Bartholomew prepared to join him in Spain to help for his project. You see, we know that Columbus went and talked to Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492. He also talked to them in 1489. But at that point, they weren't interested. They were having a war to clear the Iberian Peninsula of the Moors, so this kind of information kind of took a back seat. But before Columbus left Lisbon, he copied a number of the Portuguese maps from the secret archive, which he transferred to 11 sheets of paper because paper was lighter and easier to conceal than parchment. The Columbus brothers then sold these valuable stolen maps in Italy for substantial sums, and also then dispersed vital information that had been held only by the Portuguese, and now this information was starting to flow into Italy and other parts of Central Europe. So with their circumstances, their financial circumstances alleviated by the map sales, the two brothers were able to reassemble the 11 sheets into a map, modified it to incorporate material, particularly what they saw from Toscanelli, and then took this on the road to places like France and England, where again they tried to get some of the royal houses to be interested in their voyages. Well, they ran into the same problem wherever they went, because the king would turn to his map makers and his scientists, his savants, and say, what do you think of this idea? And everybody pretty much had the same idea. Your Majesty, it won't work. Asia is much too far away. We don't know where Señor Columbus has gotten his figures from, but we don't agree with him. And so he was turned away. But finally, in 1492, he went before Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain. Now, the year 1492 was a critical one, because early in the year, the Spanish kingdom that had been united by the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella finally had expelled the Moors from their stronghold at Granada. So that is, there was no longer a Moorish kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula. Now you had Portugal, you had Spain, and the countries then were united entirely under Christianity. With that in mind, we find that Ferdinand and Isabella are now getting ideas about, well, we've managed to free our country from the infidel, the unbeliever, as they consider the Muslims. Why don't we go further? Let us find other lands that we can dedicate to Christianity. So Columbus was able to convince their Catholic majesties, because that was their title, who had recently expelled the Moors, that a voyage like this would permit them to spread Catholicism to a new part of the world as well. Now remember, they're still thinking China or Cathay. Author Carol Delaney, in her book, Columbus and the Quest for Jerusalem, argues that religion was a major contributing factor in the decision to support Columbus's venture by Ferdinand and Isabella. Well, sort of. Because the navigators around the Spanish court said, we don't think this is going to work. Did they give Columbus the best ships available? Not on your life. They gave him three of the worst ships in all of Spain. They were very, very small ships. They were poor ships. The first one we'll see is the Pinta. The captain of that was Martin Alonso Pinzon. We have two Pinzon brothers, and both of them are some of Columbus's captains. The Pinta was crewed by only 26 men. Next, we have the Niña. The captain there was Vicente Pinzon, so that's the brother of Martin. That crew was only 24 men. That was the smallest of Columbus' ships. And then finally, we have the Santa Maria, where the master and owner was Juan de la Cosa. That had a lordly crew of all of 40 men. So when you talk about Columbus going to the New World, this is a voyage of less than 100 sailors. This is minuscule. The ships themselves were so small that if you had modern-day replicas of these ships and you were to take the average football stadium and fill it with water, you could put all three ships in that stadium and they wouldn't collide with each other. So here's what the ships look like. This is a replica of the Pinta. Here's the Niña, also known as the Santa Clara. And finally, we have the Santa Maria, which was the flagship. So in August of 1492, Columbus, with his 3 rather ratty little ships and fewer than 100 men sailing under his command, left Palos in Spain and sailed to the Canary Islands, where they would make their first stop, replenish provisions, and then sail across the Atlantic Ocean. Well, it didn't happen quite like that, because when they got to the Canary Islands, they found that something was wrong with the rudder on the Pinta. And so consequently, they spent an entire month sitting in dry dock in the Canary Islands trying to fix that rudder. By the way, some historians think it was actually sabotage by one of the Pinzon brothers, because they weren't crazy about this trip. They didn't like going. They didn't think they were going to make a particular amount of money. And so if you take that argument, well, they were going to do everything they could to make sure that this didn't happen. So we have the first voyage. We know that on the 12th of October, he landed in the Bahamas, possibly at Watlings Island. There was a mutiny on the way around the 8th or 9th of October, where the sailors realized they were running out of provisions and they might not have enough food and water to get back to Spain. So they came in a deputation to Columbus, and Columbus did one heck of a snow job on them. Hey, we're right where I said we'd be. I know where we are. We're only about 3 days away, so give me those 3 days, and then if you don't like it, we'll sail back. Sure enough, on the evening of the 11th of October, they saw a light on the far western horizon, and all of a sudden the world was good. So they traveled around the Caribbean. Columbus left a small garrison. The Santa Maria was shipwrecked, but nevertheless, he made it back to Spain. By the way, the first place he hit on the other side of the Atlantic was in the Azores, where the local Portuguese commander arrested him because he thought that Columbus's men were pirates. Well, they got past that. Then they landed at Lisbon, where once again he was arrested, not because they thought he was a pirate, but because they thought he had been poaching on Portuguese trading preserves. Nevertheless, he made it back to Spain, received a hero's welcome, wrote letters to their majesties talking about all the spices he found, great mines of gold, other metals. He didn't run across a single piece of gold on that first voyage. But he said, I saw the mines where they get it from, so that's just as good. Well, he managed to talk their majesties into it, and later on in 1493, another expedition went out under Columbus's command, and that was 17 ships, so obviously they took him a little more seriously. Now, nevertheless, when we look at that voyage, we see the fact that he didn't bring back an awful lot. Brought back some natives, he brought back a few plants, things like that. And another Genoese explorer by the name of John Cabot said, I know what his problem was. He was too far south. He wasn't where all the riches were. That's further north. So Cabot, sailing under the flag of Henry VII of England, decided to use a northern route. Well, you can see what he did here. He managed to get to Newfoundland, discover Canada on behalf of England, which didn't appreciate it at the time, because once again, there were no spices, no gold. So by about 1502, this is what the world looked like, according to the Portuguese. You see, by that time, namely 1500, they had already discovered Brazil. So that's that little bump there. And if you look a little bit above that, you've got Puerto Rico, you've got Cuba, so obviously something's out there. And Columbus, well, he did a pretty good job. He actually found stuff. On the other side of the world, there's Africa, finally shown with the fact that you can get around it. We have India, and of course there are things further east, and the Portuguese have yet to discover what they are. So consequently, all this is going on, and many people are getting interested in voyages to this new world. One of them is this gentleman, Amerigo Vespucci. He started out as a banker in Florence. He was an agent of the Medici, and he was sent to Cadiz in Spain to investigate possible fraud by one of the managers of the Medici branch there. In 1495, the Spanish crown had gotten a little tired of Columbus and all of his demands for wealth, his demands for royal titles and stuff like that, and so they were kind of farming out for other people to explore. By this time, Vespucci was making a name for himself as a provider of food, and he says, let me go. So Vespucci, who wrote his own memoirs, says, well, I took 4 voyages. Unfortunately, we can only find proof of 2 of them. But on his second voyage, he went down the coast, the eastern coast of South America, which is fairly straight, doesn't have a lot of inlets and stuff, and he didn't see any cities. And he's saying, you know, this does not look like what I thought Asia would look like. So he wrote a letter about his discoveries to the head of the Florentine Republic, a gentleman by the name of Soderini, and a German geographer by the name of Waldseemüller got hold of that letter and took this as proof that what Vespucci had found was not some part of Asia, but an entirely new world. So consequently, he wrote, what we may rightly call a new world, said Vespucci, a continent more densely populated and abounding in animals than are Europe or Asia or Africa, and a climate milder and more delightful than any other region known to us. He obviously had not run across hurricanes, malaria, or yellow fever yet. So Waldseemüller decided in 1507 to publish his own map. And as you can see, you've got South America with a long coast, there's Africa. All the little parts are starting to come together. But he did one thing more. Up here in the corner, he gave credit to the man that he said actually understood that this is not Asia, this is a new world. So he took the Latin form of Vespucci's first name, Amerigo. In Latin, it's Americus, and he used the feminine form, so it was similar to Europa, Asia, Africa, and he called the New World America. And it's very important that he did that, because otherwise we'd be living in the United States of Vespucci, or in the fall we'd be following the exploits of the Vespucci football conference of the NFL. Jakob Fugger, a banker from Augsburg, Germany. Until Elon Musk came along, he was considered to have been the richest man in history. His net worth estimated, as you can see, is about $400 billion. And he had been loaning money to the Holy Roman Emperor. And you know, back in those days, the emperors didn't pay you back. What they said is, I'll tell you what, because you loaned me money, you can manage all the copper mines or all the silver mines in my domain. And that's exactly what Fugger did. Well, he discovered something. He was the biggest copper miner in Europe, and the Portuguese came back from India and said, you know what we really need to trade with these people? Copper. Because in India, they use copper for everything. They coin it into money. They make cauldrons for boiling rice. So you can't give us more copper than we can use. And sure enough, the Fuggers, through the Portuguese, imported almost 3,000 tons of copper to India, allowing them to net a profit of more than 1 million ducats. Well, the Portuguese, as we said, were going further and further east. And finally, you remember how this all started? The Spice Islands? They found the Spice Islands, known today as the Molucca. Back then they were called the Moluccas. And you can see there's a whole bunch of little islands there, you know, where you could find things like cinnamon, you know, vanilla, all the different spices that they wanted. And here's where they're located, you know, in modern Indonesia today. But in the meantime, with Columbus having sailed originally for Spain, and with the Portuguese now doing great guns, there were problems on the horizon. Who did all this belong to? I mean, you know, what are we going to do if we run into each other? So in 1494, the Pope, who, by the way, was a Spanish gentleman by the name of Rodrigo Borja, B-O-R-J-A, the Italians pronounced it Borgia, created a line, as you can see there, at the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. And basically they said is, okay, here's how it works. Everything to the east of this line, Portugal, it's yours to explore. Everything west of the line, that's Spanish. And you see how interesting that is, that even the little bump of Portugal, or Brazil rather, that Portugal had discovered works out perfectly. The problem was, now that they're discovering the Spice Islands and going to the other side of the world, how's that going to work out? So they started with a line, with the idea being that both the Portuguese and the Spanish get half the world, 180 degrees. But that wasn't good enough for the Holy Roman Emperor and Spanish king, so he doctored the line so that the Spice Islands came out on his side of the line. You see the funny little yellow thing there? That's the doctored line. Because the Spanish king and Holy Roman Emperor at the time, Charles V, was in the middle of a bunch of wars, he didn't need the spices. What he needed was money. So having just robbed the Portuguese of the Spice Islands, which are on their side of the line, he turns right around and for 350,000 ducats sells them the spice rights to their own islands. This is my last slide. So there was the world, and there was what I like to call the global web, 16th century style. You see the Portuguese lines in blue, lines of trade. You see the lines in white, those are the Spanish lines, and soon every country in Europe wanted to get in on this. Suddenly, little concerns in Europe meant nothing as everyone was trying to get more and more colonies and trying to find greater and greater riches in overseas areas. And to think all of that started with sailors, spices, and spies. Thank you very much for your attention.
Will you hang around for some questions?
Absolutely. We'll take questions.
Just one or two questions now, and then he'll stay on later. Some of you I know need to run to the buses. Wait for the ushers to bring a microphone. Here's a mic. A question down here.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Any idea why they changed the maps to have north up?
I'm sorry, I didn't entirely hear it.
North up, when it was west. Yeah.
I don't know. That seemed to be a common convention. You saw that some of the maps had north off to the left. But yeah, they started doing them, and that became kind of the way everybody did it, with north being up.
Another question? Here we go.
Yes, ma'am.
Wait for the mic, please.
Thank you. How did you get interested and learn about this? And from how long ago?
Well, I've always been interested in history. And when I was in high school, I hated the history that was being taught. Because, it was taught, Columbus, 1492, boom, that's it, let's move on. And I said to myself, there's got to be more to the story than this. And so I was in the military for quite a number of years and discovered that the military liked historians. So I was a military historian for part of my career and started digging into the stories. Well, what's behind this? What is Columbus really about? Another of my topics, what did Machiavelli really want? Why did he write such nasty stuff about princes and stuff like that? Well, there's a story behind that. And I discovered that almost any area in history that you look at has probably a backstory behind a backstory behind a backstory. You got to find it, you've got to see the connections, and then you suddenly find what really happened. Even things that people think they know for granted. Like, we've all heard of the Battle of Waterloo, right? Does anybody really know what happened at the Battle of Waterloo? Well, Napoleon got defeated, but you don't know how. That's part of the study, is actually looking at things like the fact that part of the reason for Napoleon's defeat was he was probably suffering from hemorrhoids and couldn't get on his horse, so he could not make a personal observation of the battlefield, which he normally did.
That's another talk for some other time.
Well, there you go. And consequently, he missed a few things that he shouldn't have missed.
I know some of you need to go to the buses, but we'll hang around for additional questions here. Go ahead and leave if you need to get to a bus.
But thank you very much for your attention tonight.
Well, thank you. Okay. Yeah, that was terrific.
We still have questions? Yes, we do. Where's our mic person? Hello? I see a hand.
Usher, please. Yeah. Thanks.
I may have missed this, but have you written a book about all this?
No.
You should. I love.
Since you bring up the topic of books, my third book was just published in February, but it has nothing to do with what we did here. I've written a 2-volume biography about my father.
Oh,
And by the way, he's part of the reason I'm interested in history, because he started talking about his exploits in the Second World War and then in Korea. And I got so interested, I started to read up. And I have to admit that part of the reason I was reading up was I was trying to trip the old man up, you know, with maybe, shall we say, a little bit of a phony war story. And I never was able to.
Okay, will you hang around a little bit?
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
come on down up front if you want to